From the first day George S. Patton studied military history, he imagined war differently than most of his contemporaries. To him, maps were not just coordinates, they were living terrain, shaped by human fear, pride, and instinct. He saw that battles were won not merely by guns or numbers, but by understanding how soldiers, commanders, and even civilians would react under stress. While other generals focused on logistics or strict adherence to orders, Patton studied anticipation. He believed that predicting how people would respond to chaos was the true art of war, and that insight would allow a commander to move decisively while the enemy faltered in hesitation. This insight was not abstract philosophy. It was drawn from observation of every unit he ever commanded, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe, and it defined the core of his vision of war. Even in peacetime drills and exercises before World War II, Patton's approach was unusual. He demanded constant readiness, not for parade purposes, but for the reality of combat. When observing maneuvers, he would intentionally introduce unexpected obstacles or simulated enemy attacks. Soldiers and officers who failed to react quickly or decisively were reprimanded, not for disobedience, but for failing to anticipate uncertainty. To Patton, the chaos of battle could not be tamed with rules alone. Victory required shaping the thinking of one's troops, teaching them to act instinctively yet purposefully under pressure. In every decision, he tested not just ability but psychological resilience. Patton's time in World War I, particularly his work with tanks, reinforced this vision. He realized that innovation on the battlefield was not enough. The human mind must be prepared to exploit it. Tanks could break lines, but only if the men inside trusted themselves and their leaders to act without hesitation. He spent hours drilling crews in coordination and speed, emphasizing that action itself could be a weapon. Even minor hesitation, he observed, could nullify technological advantages. It was this understanding of the psychological interplay between technology, terrain, and morale that set him apart. When he arrived in North Africa in 1942, Patton's philosophy faced its first large-scale test. American troops were demoralized, supply lines weak, and leadership tentative. Patton's vision required him to impose a mindset of aggression, decisiveness, and speed. He enforced strict discipline, but he also communicated with his men directly, showing personal courage and engagement. Soldiers quickly recognized that hesitation was unacceptable, not for punishment, but because inaction was deadly. Patton's method was effective, but it was also exhausting and controversial. He understood that his vision of war demanded more from his troops than conventional doctrine, and he accepted the risk of personal unpopularity in order to make his philosophy effective. In Sicily, his approach became even more visible. Allied forces debated and planned meticulously, but Patton moved with a sense of urgency that shocked his colleagues. He saw the battle as a dynamic organism rather than a static problem. By advancing rapidly, exploiting weak points, and maintaining momentum, he forced German units into reactive positions, destabilizing their plans before they could take shape. Patton's vision of war was not linear. It was anticipatory, psychological, and kinetic. He did not merely fight enemies. He shaped their perception, forcing them into decisions that played into his hands. Patton's relationship with other commanders, particularly Montgomery, highlighted how revolutionary his approach was. While Montgomery emphasized careful planning and measured advances, Patton prioritized initiative and speed. He did not dismiss logistics or strategy, but he believed that the human element, the enemy's response, the morale of his men, was the decisive factor. This philosophy often led to friction, but it also produced results. In both victories and setbacks, Patton's ability to read and influence the human dimension of war made his campaigns distinct. During the Normandy campaign, Patton's vision was not just applied on the battlefield, but in the theater of perception. He became the centerpiece of the deception operation to convince the Germans that the main invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais. Through this, he demonstrated a fundamental truth of his philosophy: war is fought as much in the mind as it is on land. Patton understood that a general who could manipulate perception could achieve victories without direct combat. This insight reinforced his belief that psychology and momentum were inseparable from strategy. The Third Army's advance across France was a living testament to Patton's vision. He moved faster than supply lines could comfortably manage, but his decisions were rooted in his understanding of tempo and fear. Enemy forces could not predict his movements, creating constant disarray. His troops were constantly challenged yet inspired because Patton had instilled the belief that decisive action created safety. Speed, precision, and psychological dominance were, for him, intertwined principles. Even in the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's philosophy held. When the 101st Airborne was surrounded in Bastogne, he executed a rapid, audacious maneuver that relieved the encircled units. This was more than logistics or brute force. It was an application of his understanding of morale, timing, and human perception. The enemy expected caution. Patton delivered relentless advance. His vision of war as a kinetic, psychological, and moral contest came fully alive, proving that the human mind could be as decisive as weapons. Patton's vision also emphasized adaptability. He believed that rigid adherence to doctrine was a weakness. In his campaigns, he continually adjusted tactics based on real-time observation of enemy behavior and troop response. This flexibility was born of his understanding that war is unpredictable and that the most important variable is human reaction. No plan, no matter how carefully drawn, could replace the ability to respond decisively and with awareness. Yet his vision was not without controversy. Patton's insistence on action and speed sometimes led to friction with political leaders and Allied commanders. His personality and philosophy were not easily contained within bureaucracy or peacetime structures. He understood that the clarity and decisiveness required in combat could be unsettling in diplomatic and administrative settings. This tension demonstrated that his vision of war was deeply human-centered. It demanded courage not just from soldiers but from those in leadership who had to allow bold action to succeed. The cost of his vision was personal as well. Patton's relentless approach strained relationships, tested loyalty, and sometimes endangered those under his command. He accepted these risks because he saw the greater moral imperative. Decisive action, when executed correctly, reduced prolonged suffering and disorientation. In his mind, hesitation was a greater killer than boldness, and any discomfort caused by rapid decisions was outweighed by the preservation of initiative and survival. Finally, the enduring power of Patton's vision lies in its application beyond his lifetime. Modern military theory still studies his campaigns because they exemplify the integration of psychology, tempo, and human understanding. He demonstrated that leadership is not simply about issuing commands, but about shaping behavior, influencing perception, and instilling confidence. His campaigns remain case studies in the art of decisive motion and the psychological dimensions of command. Patton's understanding of tempo and human reaction became most evident during the rapid movements of the Third Army across France. Unlike other commanders who paused to consolidate gains or wait for reports, Patton pushed forward relentlessly. He understood that hesitation allowed the enemy time to recover, to regroup, to anticipate, and to strike back. His philosophy was simple yet profound. Momentum is both a shield and a weapon. By moving quickly, Patton denied the Germans any chance to stabilize their lines, creating confusion and fear that was more destructive than artillery. Each mile his tanks advanced was a psychological victory, a demonstration of initiative that inspired his men and unsettled the enemy. This relentless motion, however, was not without risk. Supplies could not always keep pace. Communication lines were stretched thin, and exhausted soldiers sometimes questioned the feasibility of constant advance. Yet Patton's insight into human psychology allowed him to manage these risks. He understood that when soldiers were in motion and focused on an immediate objective, fear and fatigue were overshadowed by purpose. Every forced march, every rapid attack, reinforced the lesson he had drilled into his troops from the beginning. Decisive action breeds confidence, hesitation breeds disaster. The Battle of Metz demonstrated this principle in action. Patton faced a heavily fortified German city that would have stalled a cautious commander. Conventional doctrine would have suggested encirclement and siege, but Patton assessed the human element, the morale of both his troops and the defenders. He orchestrated attacks on multiple fronts, creating the impression of omnipresence and unpredictability. German defenders, overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the assault, began to crumble psychologically before the city walls were fully breached. Victory was as much mental as physical, and Patton's understanding of morale and momentum had tipped the scales. In Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's vision reached its dramatic apex. The surprise German offensive caught Allied forces off guard, and panic rippled through the lines. The situation demanded more than strategy. It demanded understanding the human response to fear. Patton did not hesitate. Within days, he mobilized the Third Army on a daring route through treacherous terrain in freezing winter conditions to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The operation was audacious, and its success rested not on sheer numbers but on his ability to control tempo, instill confidence, and outmaneuver enemy expectations. Soldiers felt certainty because their commander had already acted decisively. Patton's insight into psychology was complemented by his study of history. He frequently quoted Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great, not as inspiration but as empirical evidence that speed and decisive action had consistently outweighed cautious planning. He understood that in historical battles, hesitation often proved fatal, and decisive leaders created conditions where the enemy was forced to react rather than act. This study shaped not only his battlefield tactics but also his broader philosophy. War is a contest of wills, and the general who manipulates perception and morale as effectively as weapons dominates the battlefield. Yet, for all his brilliance, Patton's vision of war was not infallible. The slapping incidents in Sicily revealed the limits of his human-centric philosophy. He expected courage, speed, and initiative from soldiers and officers alike, but when confronted with exhaustion and trauma, some reacted unpredictably. The public scandal that followed demonstrated that understanding psychology in combat does not always translate to societal or political acceptance. Patton's philosophy demanded extremes, and extremes are difficult to reconcile with bureaucracy and public opinion. Despite setbacks, Patton's vision continued to evolve. He recognized that leadership required constant adaptation, not merely enforcing rules or plans. In the chaos of rapidly advancing campaigns, he made decisions on observation, instinct, and understanding of human behavior rather than waiting for perfect intelligence. His victories were therefore not preordained but dynamically created through interaction with both men and environment. Patton's vision was organic. He shaped circumstances as much as he responded to them. Patton also understood the significance of symbolism and presence. He frequently visited forward positions personally, not for vanity, but because the sight of a commander in motion emboldened soldiers. The psychological effect of his visibility was enormous. Men who saw Patton on the front lines internalized his certainty even when they were terrified. His presence functioned as a conduit for morale, proving that leadership is not just about orders, it is about perception, confidence, and example. The coordination of speed, psychological insight, and tactical flexibility became especially evident during the liberation of France. Patton's forces frequently advanced ahead of logistical capabilities, a calculated risk he justified through an understanding of human endurance. Troops that moved decisively, even beyond expected limits, retained focus and resilience, while the Germans, constantly reacting to unexpected maneuvers, suffered mounting disorientation. Patton's vision turned the human element from a vulnerability into a force multiplier. Even post-D-Day, when operational constraints tightened and Allied command demanded cautious advancement, Patton continued to prioritize momentum. His understanding of war as a contest of psychological and kinetic forces sometimes clashed with traditional strategic thinking. While others paused to wait for reinforcements or approvals, he pushed ahead. confident that initiative itself would create options and opportunities that careful planning could not. His decisions repeatedly proved the effectiveness of a vision that combined speed, foresight, and the human factor. Patton's interaction with other generals also reflected his vision. Allies often found him brash and unpredictable, yet those who studied his methodology recognized the underlying principle. He acted to control outcomes, not merely react to circumstances. He anticipated enemy responses, preempted hesitation among his own troops, and integrated psychological insight into operational planning. His genius lay in seeing war as a system of cause and effect that depended as much on the mind as on the battlefield. The campaigns in Germany further underscored his philosophy. Patton's forces moved rapidly, maintaining pressure and forcing surrender through both maneuver and intimidation. His vision required that victories be immediate, overwhelming, and psychologically decisive. He understood that prolonged engagement allowed fear to fester, discipline to erode, and morale to collapse. By acting with speed and clarity, he maintained cohesion and effectiveness across a vast and fluid front. Patton's vision of war extended beyond mere military success. He saw broader implications for leadership, decision-making, and human behavior. Victory, he realized, was inseparable from understanding human motivation, anticipating reactions, and harnessing confidence. He argued that a leader's responsibility was not just tactical execution, but shaping the conditions in which men could act decisively without fear. Leadership, he believed, was ultimately about controlling the human element as much as terrain or firepower. Even as the war ended, Patton's philosophy remained relevant. He reflected that the principles of momentum, psychological insight, and decisive action could be applied beyond combat. His vision was fundamentally about human potential. In any domain of high stakes, the combination of speed, clarity, and anticipation could overcome uncertainty and fear. For Patton, war was both an arena and a lesson, a proving ground for understanding how humans respond under pressure and how leadership can harness or fail that response. As Patton's campaigns came to a close, the reality of victory forced him to confront the limitations and consequences of his vision. War had demanded relentless speed, unyielding discipline, and psychological insight, yet the cost was visible in exhausted men, shattered towns, and displaced civilians. Patton understood that victory was never clean, that the human toll of momentum and action could be profound. Even as allies celebrated, he walked among his troops, observing the fatigue, the fear, and the subtle tension left behind by battles fought at his pace. For him, understanding the human cost was as important as measuring territory gained. His approach to post-war planning reflected the same philosophy. Patton believed that the lessons of war extended beyond strategy into human behavior. He argued that nations, armies, and leaders must internalize the principles of momentum, anticipation, and psychological dominance to prevent hesitation from undermining success. Even in peace, he saw the risk of paralysis, of slow thinking, and of fear-driven decision-making. Patton's vision was enduring because it was about shaping minds as much as shaping battlefields. When interacting with Allied commanders, Patton's perspective often created tension. While others focused on political alignment or traditional logistics, he emphasized tempo and decisiveness. He respected their expertise but challenged their assumptions, arguing that the human factor was the ultimate determinant of outcome. His colleagues often interpreted this as arrogance, yet it was grounded in empirical observation. Patton had witnessed hesitation destroy offensives, miscommunication paralyze units, and fear undermine otherwise favorable engagements. His insistence on action was rooted in both pragmatism and deep psychological understanding. Patton's reflections on leadership were equally revealing. He insisted that authority and presence were inseparable. Leaders must be visible, decisive, and inspiring, otherwise fear and uncertainty would dominate. He illustrated this principle repeatedly from North Africa to the Rhine by positioning himself where the stress of action was most intense. Soldiers, seeing him unflinching in the face of danger, internalized confidence. He understood that morale was contagious and that the right example could outweigh the disadvantages of terrain, supply, or numbers. Leadership, in Patton's vision, was a direct transfer of courage and certainty. His philosophy extended to the use of technology as well. Patton recognized that tanks, artillery, and mechanized forces were potent, but only when human operators understood how to exploit them decisively. A machine could be powerful, but in the hands of uncertain men, it could become a liability. Patton's insistence on rigorous training, constant drills, and exposure to risk ensured that his forces did not hesitate at critical moments. He molded men to act instinctively yet intelligently, creating a force that was fast, lethal, and psychologically resilient. Even in encounters with political authorities, Patton's vision persisted. His candor, often reckless, demonstrated that he valued truth over comfort. He believed that clarity, decisiveness, and foresight were more important than appeasing opinion. This occasionally cost him favor, yet it reinforced the principle that leadership is about responsibility, not popularity. Patton's vision of war demanded honesty with oneself, one's men, and the broader context of conflict. Hesitation in thought or action could be fatal. Patton's study of history continued to guide his thinking. He analyzed campaigns from Alexander to Napoleon, identifying patterns of momentum, psychological manipulation, and rapid decision-making. He observed that even superior forces could be undone by hesitation, indecision, or loss of morale. Conversely, leaders who acted boldly, even at risk, often achieved disproportionate results. This historical lens allowed Patton to refine his philosophy continually, integrating past lessons into present actions with uncanny accuracy. His human-centric approach was apparent during the final push into Germany. While traditional planning might have slowed advances to consolidate logistics or respect rigid chain-of-command norms, Patton pressed forward. German forces, demoralized and reactive, struggled to predict movements and maintain cohesion. Patton understood that speed, decisiveness, and constant pressure would disorient opponents more than sheer firepower alone. The result was a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological mastery, a hallmark of his enduring vision of war. Even after the conflict ended, Patton's reflections reinforced his philosophy. He noted that leadership, whether in war or peace, depended on understanding human response under pressure. The ability to act decisively, anticipate reactions, and maintain momentum was not limited to the battlefield. It was equally applicable to organizations, decision-making, and crisis management. Patton's insight into human behavior elevated him beyond a tactical commander to a thinker whose lessons transcended time and context. His vision also acknowledged the moral dimensions of action. Patton was aware that pushing soldiers to extremes imposed burdens, yet he weighed those burdens against the greater costs of delay, hesitation, and uncertainty. For him, decisive action reduced prolonged suffering, prevented stalemate, and preserved the broader capacity for initiative. Leadership was therefore both strategic and ethical, demanding courage, judgment, and a profound understanding of human limits. Patton's legacy lies not only in victories or public controversy, but in the enduring principles he demonstrated. Modern militaries study his campaigns not simply for battlefield tactics, but for the integration of psychology, speed, and human decision-making. He proved that morale, momentum, and decisiveness are as critical as artillery, armor, or numbers. His vision reframed war as a contest of perception and response, a dynamic interplay between action and reaction that continues to inform strategy today. Yet Patton's philosophy remains challenging. It requires a tolerance for risk, an ability to act decisively amidst uncertainty, and the courage to confront human fear head-on. These qualities made him extraordinary, but also controversial. They demanded more from subordinates, peers, and political authorities than conventional norms allowed. Patton's vision was both brilliant and exacting, rewarding audacity while punishing hesitation and leaving a legacy of reflection and debate. Ultimately, Patton's vision of war endures because it integrates the human element at every level. Speed, decisiveness, perception, morale, and psychological mastery were not optional strategies. They were central to success. He demonstrated that leadership is not merely about issuing orders but about shaping the conditions for human action, controlling uncertainty and turning fear into purpose. This vision, tested in the deserts of Africa, the hills of Sicily, and the forests of Europe, remains instructive not only to military commanders but to anyone facing the pressures of high-stakes decision-making. Finally, Patton's vision leaves us with a question that resonates as powerfully today as it did in 1945. When confronted with uncertainty, fear, or hesitation, do we act with decisiveness and clarity, or do we wait for certainty that may never come? In answering that question, one touches the essence of Patton's philosophy, a timeless lesson that war, leadership, and life itself are determined not by circumstance alone, but by the courage and insight to act before hesitation takes hold.